The coffee was still steaming when Tom Mitchell heard the sound. Not the usual creak of settling wood or the whisper of wind through weathered boards, but something else entirely. Something that made his weathered hands pause mid-reach for his morning cup and his heart skip in a way it hadn't for 3 long years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was crying, soft, muffled, coming from the direction of his old red barn. Tom had been alone on Willow Creek Ranch since Sarah passed, and in all that time, the only sounds that echoed across his 40 acres were his own footsteps, the occasional moo from his small herd, and the relentless silence that grief brings. But this morning, October 28th, 2024, something had changed. He stepped onto his porch, boots heavy against wood that had seen better decades, and listened again. There it was, faint but unmistakable, not one voice, but several. Children's voices. What Tom discovered in that barn would crack open his carefully guarded heart and transform not just his own life, but an entire community's understanding of what family really means. Tom Mitchell had never planned on being alone. When he and Sarah bought Willow Creek Ranch 12 years ago, they'd painted the spare bedroom yellow, neutral, and hopeful. They'd talked about school buses rumbling up their gravel drive, about Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across hardwood floors, about teaching small hands to gentle touch a calf's nose or collect warm eggs from the henhouse. But life, as Tom had learned the hard way, rarely consulted your plans before rearranging everything you thought you knew about tomorrow. Now at 45, his morning routine had become a study in efficient solitude. Up at 5:30, coffee black and bitter, check the cattle, mend whatever needed mending, eat something forgettable over the kitchen sink, and try not to look too long at Sarah's empty chair at the dining table. The house felt too big and too quiet, but it was theirs, his now, and selling felt like giving up on the dreams they'd built together. Cedar Falls, Colorado, wasn't the kind of place where much happened unexpectedly. Population 793, if you counted Mrs. Henderson's new grandbaby. The town existed in that sweet spot between wilderness and civilization where everyone knew everyone else's business and mostly pretended they didn't. Tom's ranch sat on the outskirts, where the last streetlight gave way to mountain darkness, and the nearest neighbor was Dr. Becca Chen, whose clinic sat a mile down the valley road. The October morning when everything changed started like every other. Tom's alarm buzzed at 5:30, though he'd been awake for the better part of an hour, watching shadows shift across the ceiling and listening to the furnace cycle on and off. Autumn in the Rockies meant mornings that bit at exposed skin and afternoons that remembered summer, but today felt different. The air carried weight, like snow was thinking about making an early appearance. He'd pulled on yesterday's jeans and a flannel shirt Sarah had given him for their 7th anniversary, the blue one with pearl snaps that she'd said made his eyes look like Colorado sky. Habit made him reach for 2 coffee mugs before remembering, again, that he only needed one. The second mug went back in the cabinet with the gentle care of a man who'd made this mistake enough times to know it would happen again. Coffee in hand, Tom stepped onto the front porch that Sarah had insisted they build wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and morning conversations. The mountains rose around him like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with the first gold of sunrise. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called, and his small herd of cattle moved slowly across the pasture, their breath visible in the cold air. That's when he heard it. The sound was so foreign to his carefully ordered solitude that for a moment, Tom wondered if his mind was playing tricks. 3 years of mostly silence could do things to a person's perception. But no, there it was again. Crying, definitely crying, coming from the direction of the old red barn that had stood on this property since the 1940s. Tom set his coffee mug on the porch rail and walked toward the sound, his boots crunching through frost-stiff grass. The Barn loomed ahead, its red paint faded to the color of dried roses, its weathered wood bearing the scars of decades of mountain weather. He used it mostly for storage now, old equipment and hay bales, Sarah's gardening tools that he couldn't bring himself to move or use. As he approached, the crying became clearer, more distinct. Not one voice, but several. Children's voices, young ones, trying to muffle their sobs and failing. Tom's heart began to pound in a way it hadn't since the night Sarah's breathing had grown too shallow and too distant. His hand trembled as he reached for the barn door's iron handle, worn smooth by generations of palms. The hinges protested with a long, low creak that seemed to echo across the entire valley. What he found inside changed everything. Huddled in the far corner of the barn, nestled among hay bales and covered by a collection of threadbare blankets and torn tarps, were 8 children. 8 pairs of eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, stared back at him from faces streaked with dirt and tears. They ranged in age from what looked like 3 years old to maybe 12, their clothes too thin for the October cold, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. For a moment, nobody moved. Tom stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, while the children watched him with the wary stillness of wild animals deciding whether to run or fight. The oldest, a girl with brown hair escaping from a makeshift ponytail, stepped slightly forward. Her chin lifted with a defiance that didn't quite hide the terror in her dark eyes. "Please don't call the police," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "We'll leave. We promise we'll leave. We just needed somewhere warm to sleep." Tom found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "How long have you been here?" The girl, clearly the leader of this small group, exchanged glances with the others before answering. 3 days, maybe 4. We tried not to make noise. We tried not to bother anything. "Are you hurt?" Tom asked, taking a careful step closer. "Any of you hurt?" A little boy, maybe 7, clung to the older girl's arm. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue from cold. "Katie, I'm hungry," he whispered, and the sound of it, the simple, heartbreaking honesty of a child's need, hit Tom like a physical blow. Katie. The girl's name was Katie. And she was trying to take care of 7 other children in his barn, and they were hungry and cold and scared. And Tom realized he was standing at a crossroads he'd never seen coming. "Okay," he said, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to. "Okay, let's figure this out." He looked at the makeshift camp the children had created, noting the careful way they'd arranged their few possessions, the way the older ones positioned themselves between him and the younger children. In the corner, barely visible, was a piece of paper, folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft. "Is that for me?" Tom asked, nodding toward the paper. Katie followed his gaze, then looked back at him with something that might have been hope mixing with the fear. "We wrote it in case someone found us. In case whoever owns this place needed to know." Tom held out his hand, palm up, waiting. After a long moment, Katie picked up the paper and placed it in his palm, their fingers barely touching in the exchange. The paper was worn soft as fabric, covered in careful handwriting that spoke of a child trying very hard to make her letters perfect. Tom unfolded it slowly, aware that 8 pairs of eyes were watching his every movement. "Dear barn owner," it began, and Tom's throat tightened at the formal politeness of it. "We are sorry for being in your barn without asking. We don't have anywhere else to go right now. We are not bad kids, and we won't break anything. We just need somewhere warm until we figure out what to do next. If you need us to leave, we will. Thank you for letting us stay this long. Sincerely, Katie and the others." Below the main message, in different handwritings that ranged from careful printing to shaky scrawls, were 8 names: Katie, Ben, Lucy, Sam, Maya, Emma, Ethan, and Rose. Tom read the note twice, then looked up at the faces watching him. Each child was a story, he realized. Each one had somehow ended up here, in his barn, trusting the 12-year-old girl to keep them safe and warm. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked. The question seemed to catch Katie off guard, as if she'd expected anger or demands for explanations, not concern about their basic needs. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "Maybe, it's hard to keep track." Tom folded the note carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The gesture seemed to mean something to the children, because several of them relaxed slightly, the rigid tension in their small shoulders easing just a fraction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My name is Tom," he said. "Tom Mitchell. This is my ranch, and this is my barn, and I'm going to make you some breakfast." The reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The youngest, a little girl with tangled blonde curls, began to cry again. But this time it sounded like relief. The boy called Sam pressed closer to Katie, while several of the others exchanged glances that spoke of hope warring with disbelief. "You don't have to," Katie said quickly. "We can find somewhere else. We don't want to be trouble." "Too late," Tom said, and something in his voice must have conveyed safety rather than threat, because Katie's shoulders dropped slightly. "You're already trouble. The best kind of trouble." He turned and walked back toward the barn door, then paused and looked over his shoulder. "You coming?" "Because I make terrible pancakes, but they're better than nothing, and it's warm in the kitchen." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the littlest one rose, took a tentative step forward. That broke the spell, and suddenly all 8 children were moving, gathering their few possessions with the quick efficiency of those who'd learned to travel light and fast. As they walked across the frost-covered grass toward his house, Tom found himself thinking about yellow paint and empty bedrooms. About Sarah's voice saying they'd fill this place with laughter someday. He'd thought that dream had died with her, but maybe, just maybe, dreams were more stubborn than grief. The kitchen, which had felt too big and too quiet for 3 years, suddenly felt exactly the right size as 8 children filed through the doorway, their eyes wide with wonder at the warmth and the smell of coffee, and the simple, impossible fact that someone had invited them in from the cold. Tom looked at their faces, really looked, and saw stories written in the lines of exhaustion. Around young eyes, in the way they stood ready to run, in the careful way Katie positioned herself between him and the others, even now. Whatever had brought them to his barn, whatever had made 8 children trust their safety to an empty building and each other, it hadn't been simple or easy. But that was tomorrow's worry. Today, there were pancakes to make and stories to hear, and 8 small cold hands to warm around mugs of hot chocolate. Today, for the first time in 3 years, Tom Mitchell's house would be full of voices and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of children being children. He tied Sarah's old apron around his waist, the one with tiny flowers that had always looked ridiculous on him, but made her smile, and began pulling ingredients from cabinets, while 8 pairs of eyes watched his every move with the careful attention of those who'd learned that adults couldn't always be trusted to follow through on their promises. "Katie," he said as he reached for the flour, "you want to help me with these pancakes? I have a feeling I'm going to need all the help I can get." The smile that spread across the girl's face was like sunrise after the longest night, and Tom felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years beginning to thaw. Maybe this was how healing happened, not in the quiet, solitary way he'd expected, but in the beautiful, chaotic, utterly unexpected way that 8 cold, hungry children could walk into your life and remind you what it felt like to be needed. Again, the pancakes were, as promised, terrible, but they were warm and sweet with syrup, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, 8 children ate until they were full, while a lonely rancher discovered that his house had always been big enough for exactly the family he'd never known he was waiting for. The morning passed like a dream that Tom wasn't entirely sure he wanted to wake up from. 8 children scattered throughout his kitchen, some perched on chairs that were too big for them, others sitting cross-legged on the linoleum floor, all of them eating pancakes with the focused intensity of those who hadn't been certain when their next meal might come. Rose, the smallest at 3 years old, had somehow ended up in Tom's lap, her tiny fingers sticky with syrup as she methodically demolished a pancake cut into bite-sized pieces. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd come inside, but she'd gravitated toward him with the instinctive trust that very young children sometimes showed to safe adults. And Tom found himself adjusting his movements to accommodate her small weight against his chest. "These are really good," Lucy announced, her face brightening with the kind of smile that suggested she was the group's designated optimist. At 8, she still carried that particular brand of resilience that allowed children to find joy in the smallest kindnesses. "Way better than the crackers we found behind the gas station." Katie shot her a sharp look, clearly uncomfortable with revealing too much about their recent circumstances, but Lucy either didn't notice or chose to ignore the warning. "We've been traveling for a while," Ben said quietly. At 10, he seemed to occupy the middle ground between Katie's protective caution and Lucy's openness. Different places, different situations. Tom didn't push for details, sensing that trust would have to be earned gradually, in small increments of safety and consistency. Instead, he focused on practical concerns, the immediate needs that were easier to address than the complex web of circumstances that had brought 8 children to sleep in his barn. "When was the last time any of you had a proper bath?" he asked, and immediately regretted the question when he saw several of the children exchange embarrassed glances. "We washed in the creek," Maya said softly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. At 6, she was pale and thin, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better decades. But the water was really cold. Tom's heart clenched at the image of these children trying to stay clean in Mountain Creek water as October temperatures dropped toward freezing. "Well, there's plenty of hot water here and clean towels. We'll figure that out after breakfast." The twins, Emma and Ethan, had been whispering to each other in the corner, their 5-year-old conversation conducted in the kind of shorthand that siblings develop. Now Emma looked up at Tom with serious eyes. "Are you going to make us leave?" she asked, her question cutting straight to the heart of what they were all wondering but afraid to voice. Tom felt the weight of 8 gazes on him, saw the way Katie tensed as if preparing to gather everyone and run if his answer wasn't what they needed to hear. Rose's small hand fisted in his shirt, and he realized that whatever he said next would set the tone for everything that followed. "No," he said simply, "I'm not going to make you leave." The relief in the room was palpable, but Katie wasn't satisfied with simple reassurance. "But what happens next?" she asked, her voice carrying the burden of responsibility that no 12-year-old should have to bear. "We can't just stay here forever. People will ask questions. There are rules about kids and where they're supposed to be." Tom nodded, acknowledging the complexity of their situation. "You're right, there are rules, and people will ask questions. But right now, this morning, you're safe and warm and fed, and that's what matters. The rest we'll figure out together." It was Sam who asked the question that Tom had been dreading. "What if they want to split us up?" The 7-year-old's voice was barely above a whisper, but the fear in it was enormous. Tom looked around the kitchen at these 8 children, who had somehow found each other and chosen to stay together, creating their own family unit in the face of circumstances he was only beginning to understand. "Is that what you're worried about?" Tom asked gently. "Being separated?" The nods were unanimous and immediate, and Tom saw the way the children unconsciously moved closer to each other, the twins reaching for Katie's hands, then placing a protective arm around Maya's shoulders. "We're a family," Katie said, her chin lifting with that same defiance he'd seen in the barn. "Maybe not a regular family, but we're a family. We take care of each other." "How long have you all been together?" Tom asked. Some of us longer than others, Katie replied carefully. Lucy and Sam and I met at a group home in Denver. Ben and Maya came later. The twins were at a different place, but we found each other when... She trailed off, clearly editing herself. When things got complicated, Ben finished diplomatically. Tom was beginning to understand that these weren't siblings who had run away together, but rather a collection of children from the foster care system who had found each other and chosen to face an uncertain world as a unit rather than be separated by bureaucracy and circumstance. "And Rose?" Tom asked, looking down at the little girl who had fallen asleep against his chest, her face peaceful in a way that suggested she felt truly safe for the first time in a while. "Rose is special," Katie said, her voice softening. Her grandmother was taking care of her, but when she got sick and had to go to the hospital, they were going to put Rose in emergency placement. Temporary, they said, but we knew what temporary meant. Tom was quiet for a long moment, processing the courage it must have taken for these children to choose uncertainty over separation, to trust each other enough to leave the known difficulties of the system for the unknown challenges of life on their own. "You've been taking care of each other," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "Katie takes care of us," Lucy said loyally. "She always makes sure we have something to eat, even if she doesn't. And she knows how to make Rose stop crying when she has bad dreams." "We all take care of each other," Katie corrected. But Tom could see the weight of responsibility in her young shoulders, the way she automatically counted heads to make sure everyone was accounted for. The sound of a vehicle coming up the gravel drive interrupted their conversation, and Tom felt the immediate shift in the room's energy. 8 children who had spent recent weeks watching for danger tensed as one, ready to run. "It's okay," Tom said quickly, recognizing the engine sound. "That's Dr. Chun. She lives down the valley, and she checks on me sometimes." But Katie was already moving, gathering the younger children with efficient urgency. "We should go back to the barn. We don't want to cause trouble." "No," Tom said firmly, standing up with Rose still in his arms. The sleeping child stirred but didn't wake. "No more hiding in the barn. Dr. Chun is good people. If we're going to figure this out, we're going to need help from good people." The knock on the front door was gentle but persistent, followed by a familiar voice calling, "Tom? I saw smoke from your chimney earlier than usual. Everything okay?" Tom looked at Katie, seeing the fear and uncertainty warring with desperate hope in her eyes. "Your choice," he said quietly. "We can ask her to leave, or we can trust her. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to find a way for you all to stay together, we're going to need allies." Katie looked around at the other children, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but if she wants to call social services, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Tom said. Together, he carried Rose to the front door, the other children trailing behind him like a small parade of uncertainty. Dr. Rebecca Cheen stood on the porch, her medical bag in one hand and a thermos of what was probably coffee in the other. She was in her mid-30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of unflappable demeanor that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies in a small mountain town. She took one look at Tom holding a sleeping child, with 7 others clustered behind him, and her eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained calm and professional. "Well," she said mildly, "this is new." "Becca," Tom said, "I think I'm going to need that coffee." Dr. Chun stepped inside, her experienced gaze taking in the scene in the kitchen. The empty plates and sticky syrup spots, the way the children watched her with wary attention. "Is everyone healthy?" she asked, her question directed to Tom, but her eyes already doing a professional assessment of the children before her. "I think so," Tom replied, "but maybe you should ask them." Dr. Chun set down her bag and thermos, then crouched down to put herself at eye level with the children. "Hi there. I'm Dr. Chun, but most people call me Dr. Becca," Tom's a friend of mine, and I live just down the road. Is it okay if I make sure everyone's feeling all right?" It was a masterclass in approaching frightened children, Tom realized. No sudden movements, no overwhelming questions, just a calm offer of help. Katie stepped forward slightly, once again taking her role as spokesperson. "We're okay. Nobody's sick or hurt." "I'm glad to hear that," Dr. Chun said. "But would it be all right if I just took a quick look? Sometimes when people have been traveling or sleeping outside, little things can turn into bigger things if we don't catch them early." The examination that followed was gentle and thorough. Dr. Chun checking each child for signs of illness, injury, or malnutrition while engaging them in quiet conversation that gradually drew out their names and ages. Tom watched her work, recognizing the skill with which she was gathering information without making it feel like an interrogation. "Everyone looks pretty good, considering," she announced when she was finished. "A little underweight, and I'd like to see some of these scratches cleaned up properly, but nothing that won't improve with rest and regular meals." She accepted Tom's offer of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the children returned to their breakfast cleanup. Tom had noticed that they automatically organized themselves into efficient teams, the older ones supervising the younger ones in a way that spoke of practiced routine. "So," Dr. Chen said quietly, her voice pitched for Tom's ears only, "want to tell me how you ended up with 8 house guests?" Tom found himself telling the story of his morning discovery. Dr. Chun listening without judgment as he described finding the children in his barn, and the note that had explained their presence. He showed her the carefully folded paper, now slightly damp from being carried in his pocket. "They're from the foster system," he concluded. "As far as I can tell, they found each other and decided they'd rather face the world together than be separated by placement issues." Dr. Chun read the note, her expression thoughtful. "That takes incredible courage," she said. "And desperation. What do I do, Becca?" Tom asked. "I can't just turn them over to social services if it means they'll be split up. But I can't exactly hide 8 children on my ranch forever either. Legally, I should probably report this," Dr. Chun said slowly. "But legally and ethically aren't always the same thing." She looked around the kitchen at the children, who were pretending not to listen to the adult conversation while clearly hanging on every word. "How attached are you to doing this the conventional way?" "Not very," Tom admitted. "I was thinking more along the lines of finding a way to make it work first, then worrying about the paperwork later." Dr. Chun smiled, the first real smile Tom had seen from her since she'd arrived. "Sarah would have loved this, you know. A house full of kids who needed someone to care about them." The mention of his wife hit Tom unexpectedly, but not with the sharp pain he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it felt like recognition, like Dr. Chun had identified something he'd been feeling but hadn't been able to name. "Yeah," he said softly. "She would have." "There are ways to do this," Dr. Chun said, her voice taking on the tone of someone working through a complex problem. "Unofficial ways, at least at first. Emergency placements, kinship care evaluations, therapeutic foster arrangements. The system has flexibility when it wants to use it. And if it doesn't want to use it, then we convince it," Dr. Chun said firmly. "These kids have clearly been taking care of each other successfully. That counts for something. And you've got resources here, space, stability. That counts for something too." Katie had drifted closer during their conversation, and now she stood just at the edge of their discussion, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes hopeful. "Would we be able to stay together?" she asked. "If we did it the official way?" Dr. Chun looked at her seriously. "I won't lie to you. It would be complicated, and there would be no guarantees. But Tom's right, you're a family. And good social workers, the ones who really care about kids, they understand that families come in all different shapes." "What would happen first?" Katie asked, and Tom heard the weight of responsibility in her voice. the way she was trying to evaluate options for all 8 children. "First, we'd need to make some phone calls," Dr. Chun said. "Report that you're all safe, because I guarantee people are looking for you. Then we'd need to figure out emergency placement while the grown-ups work out the longer-term plan." "Emergency placement here?" Ben asked, speaking up from where he'd been organizing the cleaned breakfast dishes with military precision. "That's what we're going to try for," Dr. Chun confirmed. "But I need you all to understand that this process might take time, and it might get complicated, and there might be moments when it feels like things are going backwards instead of forwards." "Will they make us leave today?" Rose asked, and Tom realized the little girl had been awake and listening for longer than he'd thought. "No, sweetheart," Dr. Chun said gently. "No matter what happens, no one's making you leave today. Today, you're safe and warm and fed, and that's what matters." Tom watched the children exchange glances, some form of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Katie nodded. "Okay," she said. "We'll try the official way. But if they want to split us up, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Tom said. "Together." Dr. Chun was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through contacts with the efficiency of someone who had navigated bureaucratic systems before. "I'm going to start with Janet Morrison at the county office. She's good people, and she understands that keeping families together should be the priority." As she stepped outside to make her calls, Tom found himself alone with 8 children who had just agreed to trust the system that had failed them before. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like snow, heavy and cold and beautiful. All at once. "Are you scared?" Lucy asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of things. "Terrified," Tom admitted, and saw several of the children relax at his honesty. "Good," Katie said, surprising him. "That means you care what happens to us." "Yeah," Tom said, looking around at these 8 brave, resilient, complicated children who had walked into his life and reminded him what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. "I do." Outside, he could hear Dr. Chin's voice, calm and professional, beginning the process of turning 8 runaways into 8 family members. It would be complicated and difficult, and there would be no guarantees. But for the first time in 3 years, Tom Mitchell had a reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, and that was more hope than he'd carried in longer than he could remember. The first social worker arrived within 2 hours, driving a dusty sedan that looked like it had seen too many mountain roads and not enough maintenance. Tom watched from the kitchen window as Janet Morrison climbed out of her car, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of sensible shoes that suggested she spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Dr. Chun met her in the driveway, and Tom could see them talking quietly, Janet's head nodding as she listened to whatever briefing Dr. Chin was providing. The children had spread themselves out across the kitchen and living room with the instinctive awareness of kids who had learned to read adult moods quickly and position themselves accordingly, ready to either seek comfort or make a quiet exit. Katie stood at the front window, watching the approaching women with the intense concentration of a commander surveying incoming forces. "She doesn't look mean," she reported, though her tone held more hope than certainty. "Mean ones usually don't," Sam replied, his voice carrying the weary insight of a 7-year-old who'd already learned not to trust appearances. "They act nice until they don't." Tom's chest ached at how casually Sam said it, the way it spoke to a history of disappointment. "Sometimes," Tom said gently, "adults who work with kids get overwhelmed and forget that every kid is a person, with feelings, with fears." "But Dr. Chun told me this one is different." "How different?" asked Ben, ever the group's quiet skeptic, still sifting facts before drawing conclusions. Before Tom could answer, a knock came at the door. A woman's voice followed. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services," Dr. Chun mentioned you might have some young people here who need support. Tom opened the door and found a woman whose gaze was both kind and sharp, taking in everything, with the quick eye of someone experienced in every kind of family situation. She stepped inside and immediately knelt, lowering herself to the children's level, a gesture that caused several of them to subtly relax. "Hi there," she said with a tone that was warm but not falsely bright. "I'm Janet. Dr. Chen told me you've all been taking really good care of each other." Tom noted how perfectly pitched the introduction was. It wasn't about rule breaking or mistakes. It acknowledged what the kids had done right. Katie stepped forward, stepping into her role as the group's informal spokesperson. "We didn't do anything bad. We just needed a place to stay." "I understand," Janet replied, settling calmly into one of the kitchen chairs, her pace unhurried, clearly mindful of the tension in the room. "Dr. Chun said you've been very respectful. And Mr. Mitchell mentioned the note you left. He said it showed a lot of thought." That bit of recognition, the note treated as a gesture of respect rather than a trespass, seemed to visibly ease the group's nerves. Rose, still half hidden behind Katie, peeked out with cautious curiosity. "I do need to ask some questions," Janet continued, "and make a few phone calls, since there are people out there very worried about you. But before I do that, I want to make sure everyone understands where we stand." She took out a tablet and stylus, resting them in her lap rather than jumping straight into forms and procedures. "Right now, I see 8 kids who are safe, warm, fed, and under the care of a responsible adult. That's what matters most. Everything else we'll sort out." "Are you going to split us up?" Emma asked, her 5-year-old voice cutting to the heart of what had been weighing on all of them. Janet paused thoughtfully before answering. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you together. I won't make promises I can't keep, but I'll be honest, that depends on a lot of things, some outside my control." It wasn't the answer they hoped for, but it was real. Tom could see the kids respected that. "What kind of things?" Katie asked, already thinking several steps ahead like the 12-year-old strategist she was. "Well, for one, there's placement capacity," Janet explained. "It's tough to find homes that can take a group your size. And there are legal issues, so not all of you are in the same situation." She looked around the group with the detached focus of a professional but still managed to avoid sounding cold. "Some of you left placements without permission. Others were staying with relatives, and those arrangements fell through. And some of you," her eyes paused gently on Rose, "came out of emergency situations that aren't resolved yet. What does that mean for us?" Ben asked, his 10-year-old pragmatism cutting straight to the practical implications. "It means we have some untangling to do," Janet said. "Phone calls to make, paperwork to file, meetings to schedule. It means that for right now, we need to figure out where you're going to stay while the grown-ups work on the longer-term plan." Tom cleared his throat, drawing Janet's attention. "I'd like them to stay here, all of them, for as long as it takes, to figure out the permanent situation." Janet studied him with the careful evaluation of someone who had seen too many well-meaning adults underestimate the complexity of caring for traumatized children. "Mr. Mitchell, that's very generous, but do you understand what you're offering? 8 children, some of whom have significant trust issues and behavioral challenges related to their experiences in care. I understand that they're a family," Tom said simply, "and I understand that splitting them up would be traumatic for all of them. Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go." "Have you ever cared for children before?" Janet asked, and Tom heard the gentle probing of someone trying to assess his qualifications without being insulting. "No," Tom admitted. "But I've got space. I've got resources, and I've got time. And they've already proven they can take care of each other better than the system has been taking care of them." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly at his blunt assessment, but she didn't disagree. "That's not an inaccurate observation. But caring for 8 children requires more than good intentions. There are educational needs, medical needs, therapeutic needs. There are legal requirements for supervision and documentation. There are background checks and home studies and licensing procedures. Then let's get started on those, Tom said. But let them stay here while we do it. Janet was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options and regulations against the reality of 8 children who had already endured too much disruption. Finally, she turned back to the children. What do you think? She asked them. Would you feel safe staying here with Mr. Mitchell while we work on finding a permanent solution? The response was immediate and unanimous. 8 heads nodded, some enthusiastically, some cautiously, but all in agreement. He makes really bad pancakes, Lucy announced solemnly, but he let us eat as many as we wanted. And he didn't yell when Rose spilled syrup on his shirt, Maya added quietly. And he said we could take baths with hot water, Sam contributed. As if this were the ultimate luxury. Janet looked at Tom with something that might have been approval. All right. I can arrange emergency placement here for 72 hours while we sort out the immediate legal issues. After that, we'll need to see where we stand with licensing and longer-term arrangements. The relief in the room was palpable, but Janet wasn't finished. But I need everyone to understand that this is just a first step. There will be appointments, interviews, visits from other social workers. There will be court dates for some of you. There will be a lot of adults asking a lot of questions, and sometimes it might feel overwhelming. Will you be there? Ketty asked, and Tom heard the vulnerability under her careful composure. For the overwhelming parts? I'll be there as much as I can, Janet promised. And Mr. Mitchell will be there, and Dr. Chun will be there. You're not going to have to handle this alone. Over the next several hours, Tom's quiet ranch house became the center of a carefully orchestrated operation. Janet made phone calls from the front porch, her voice carrying the tone of someone navigating bureaucracy with practiced efficiency. Dr. Chun drove back to her clinic and returned with additional medical supplies and a bag of children's clothing, donated by families in town who had heard about the situation through the mysterious network that carried news in small communities. Sheriff Jake Harrison arrived just as the afternoon shadows were lengthening, his presence causing a momentary spike of tension among the children until they realized he was there to help rather than to arrest anyone. He was a tall man in his 40s with kind eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that law enforcement in a small town was more about problem-solving than rule enforcement. Heard we had some new residents, he said to Tom, accepting a cup of coffee and settling himself at the kitchen table where he could observe the children without crowding them. Thought I'd stop by and introduce myself, make sure everyone knows I'm one of the good guys. It was exactly the right approach, Tom realized. Not ignoring the children or treating them as problems to be solved, but acknowledging them as new community members who deserve to feel safe around local law enforcement. Katie, ever the protector, positioned herself where she could watch both Sheriff Harrison and the younger children. Are we in trouble for sleeping in the barn? She asked. Directly, not with me, Sheriff Harrison said simply. Far as I'm concerned, you found a safe place to sleep and you didn't damage anything. That's good decision-making under difficult circumstances. The simple validation of their choices, rather than criticism of their rule-breaking, visibly relaxed several of the children. Tom made a mental note to remember that approach, acknowledging the wisdom in their survival strategies rather than focusing on the technical violations they might have committed. Now there might be some paperwork to sort out with other jurisdictions, Sheriff Harrison continued, because I'm guessing you didn't all start out in Colorado. But that's grown-up paperwork, not kid problems. As the day wore on, Tom began to understand the complexity of what he'd volunteered for. Janet walked him through emergency placement requirements, basic child protection protocols, and the immediate steps needed to establish legal guardianship arrangements. Dr. Chun provided a crash course in recognizing signs of trauma responses and basic first aid for children. Sheriff Harrison explained how to navigate the intersection of family law and local regulations. But it was the children themselves who provided the most important education. Tom watched Katie, automatically checking that everyone had enough to eat, saw Ben quietly helping the younger ones wash their hands, observed how Maya stayed close to Rose during conversations with unfamiliar adults. They were a functioning family unit, he realized, with established roles and patterns and deep caring for each other. The twins had claimed the living room couch as their territory, building elaborate fortresses out of throw pillows while keeping one eye on the adult conversations happening around them. Lucy had discovered Tom's small collection of books and was reading aloud to Rose, her 8-year-old voice carefully sounding out words that were probably above her reading level. Sam had appointed himself as Tom's kitchen assistant, following him around and offering commentary on everything from the proper way to load a dishwasher to the optimal ratio of chocolate chips and cookie dough. As evening approached, Tom realized they needed to address practical sleeping arrangements. The house had 3 bedrooms, his master bedroom, the guest room that he and Sarah had optimistically painted yellow, and a small den that could serve as additional sleeping space. "We don't need much room," Katie assured him when he brought up the subject. "We're used to staying close together." "In the barn, we all slept in the loft," Ben added. "It was warmer that way." Tom felt his heart clench again at the casual mention of their recent living conditions. "Well, you've got more options here. Let's figure out what works best for everyone." What followed was a surprisingly complex negotiation involving age, gender, sleep habits, and various fears and comfort needs. Rose, it turned out, had nightmares and needed to be near Katie. The twins refused to be separated by more than arm's length. Maya was afraid of sleeping alone, but also afraid of being too far from an exit. Sam needed a nightlight, but Ben needed complete darkness. In the end, they arranged a solution that turned the yellow guest room into a communal dormitory, with mattresses and sleeping bags arranged so that everyone could see everyone else, but still have some individual space. Tom found himself touched by the careful way they organized their few possessions, each child claiming a small area but sharing everything from blankets to stuffed animals. "Are you sure this is okay?" Katie asked him as they finished setting up the sleeping arrangements. 8 kids is a lot of noise and mess. Tom looked around at his house, which for the first time in 3 years felt alive with purpose and energy. "It's more than okay," he said honestly. "It's exactly what this place needed." That night, as Tom sat in his kitchen listening to the quiet sounds of children settling in for sleep, he thought about the yellow paint that had waited so long for children's voices to make it meaningful. He thought about Sarah, who had believed that families came in all shapes and sizes, and that love was measured not in biology but in commitment. From upstairs, he could hear Katie's voice, soft and reassuring, helping Rose navigate a bad dream. In the living room, someone was whispering a quiet conversation, the words indistinct but the tone comforting. These children who had found each other and chosen to stay together despite every obstacle the world had thrown at them, had somehow also found him, had reminded him that healing wasn't always a solitary process. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more paperwork, additional meetings with social workers and lawyers and judges. There would be court dates and home studies, and the complex process of turning an emergency placement into something more permanent. There would be school enrollment and medical appointments, and the 1,000 daily decisions involved in caring for 8 children with 8 different sets of needs and fears and dreams. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Tom Mitchell's house was full of the sounds of family, and that was enough to carry him through whatever tomorrow might bring. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Friday morning that dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of wind that cut through jackets and reminded everyone that winter in the Colorado mountains didn't ask permission before arriving. Tom had been awake since 4, standing at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hands, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of worry. 8 children had changed his morning routine in ways he was still discovering. Instead of the solitary quiet that had defined his days for 3 years, the house now hummed with the orchestrated chaos of getting everyone fed, dressed, and ready for whatever the day might bring. This morning, that chaos carried an undercurrent of tension that even the youngest could sense. Rose sat at the kitchen table, carefully eating cereal one piece at a time, unaware that today adults would gather in a courthouse to decide whether she belonged with the family she'd chosen or with an aunt she couldn't remember. Katie hovered nearby, her 12-year-old face carrying the weight of responsibility that no child should have to bear. "She'll be okay, won't she?" Katie asked quietly, her voice pitched low enough that Rose couldn't hear. "Whatever happens, Rose will be okay." Tom looked at this girl who had taken on the role of protector for 7 other children, who had kept them fed and safe and together when the adult world had failed them, and felt his heart clench with fierce protectiveness. "We're going to fight for her," he said simply. "We're going to fight for all of you." The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a modest brick building that served 3 counties and looked like it had been built with the kind of sturdy determination that characterized most mountain communities. Tom had only been inside once before, years ago, for a property dispute that had been resolved with handshakes and apologies. Today felt different, weighted with consequences that would ripple through 8 young lives. Janet Morrison met them in the parking lot, her professional demeanor wrapped around what Tom was beginning to recognize as genuine affection for the children in her care. She had fought for emergency placements, expedited home studies, and bent regulations in service of keeping this unconventional family together. Today would test whether her efforts had been enough. "Margaret Hendricks arrived this morning," Janet reported, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to keep personal opinions separate from professional requirements. "She's with her attorney now, reviewing their petition." "Have you met her?" Tom asked, though he suspected Janet's assessment would be illuminating regardless of its official nature. "Briefly, she seems." Janet paused, choosing her words carefully, very focused on the legal aspects of kinship rights, less focused on Rose as an individual child with specific needs and attachments. Tom nodded, understanding the subtext. In his 3 weeks with Rose, he'd learned that she was afraid of loud voices, that she needed her stuffed rabbit to fall asleep, that she laughed at silly faces but went quiet around unfamiliar adults. She was beginning to call him Tom Tom, in the way 3-year-olds made language their own, and she had started reaching for his hand automatically when they crossed parking lots or navigated crowded spaces. The courtroom was smaller than Tom had expected, with wood paneling that had darkened with age and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, unflattering tones. Margaret Hendricks sat at a table with her attorney, a woman in her 40s, with carefully styled hair and the kind of professional polish that suggested she was more comfortable in boardrooms than playgrounds. When she turned to look at them, Tom saw a superficial resemblance to Rose in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her chin, but nothing in her expression suggested the kind of warmth or genuine interest that he would have expected from someone fighting for custody of a beloved niece. Instead, she looked at Rose with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating an acquisition. Judge Patricia Kowalski was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had presided over family court long enough to recognize the difference between genuine concern for children's welfare and adult agendas disguised as family obligation. She reviewed the files before her with methodical attention, occasionally asking questions that suggested she understood the complexity of the situation. "This court recognizes that kinship placements are generally preferred when appropriate. Family members are available and suitable," she began, her voice carrying the authority of years of difficult decisions. "However, the welfare of the child must be the primary consideration in any custody determination. Margaret Hendricks' attorney immediately launched into a presentation that focused heavily on legal precedent, blood relationships, and the irregularity of Rose's current placement with an unmarried man who had no formal training in child care. The argument was technically sound but emotionally cold, treating Rose like a legal problem to be solved rather than a traumatized child who needed stability and love. My client has only recently become aware of her niece's situation due to family estrangement, the attorney explained, but she is prepared to provide Rose with a stable, traditional family environment and the financial security that comes with her grandmother's estate. The mention of the estate was subtle but telling, and Tom saw Judge Kowalski's expression sharpen slightly at the implication. When it was their turn, Tom found himself standing before a judge who held the power to tear apart the family that had formed itself in his barn and kitchen over the past 3 weeks. He thought about 8 children learning to trust again, about Rose's nightmares gradually becoming less frequent, about the way his house had come alive with purpose and laughter. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "3 weeks ago, I found 8 children in my barn. They were cold, hungry, and scared, but they were together. They had chosen to face an uncertain world as a family, rather than be separated by a system that saw them as individual cases rather than connected lives." He looked at Janet, who nodded encouragingly, then continued. "Rose isn't just my foster placement. She's part of a family that includes 7 other children who love her, protect her, and understand her in ways that strangers can't. Separating her from that family would traumatize not just Rose, but all 8 children who have learned to depend on each other." Judge Kowalski's attention was focused and thoughtful. "Mr. Mitchell, what qualifies you to care for 8 children, particularly children who have experienced trauma and instability?" Tom had prepared for this question, but when he answered, the words came from his heart rather than his rehearsed talking points. "I don't have formal qualifications, Your Honor, but I have a house big enough for 8 children to feel safe, resources sufficient to meet their needs, and the time to be present for whatever they're going through. More importantly, they've chosen me and I've chosen them. That's not a legal qualification, but it's the foundation of every real family." Margaret Hendricks' attorney objected to the emotional nature of his argument, insisting that legal kinship rights couldn't be superseded by temporary attachments formed under irregular circumstances. But Tom saw Judge Kowalski's expression soften slightly when Rose, who had been sitting quietly in Katie's lap, suddenly called out, "Tom, Tom," and reached for him with the automatic trust of a child who knew she was safe. The hearing lasted 2 hours, with testimony from Dr. Chun about Rose's medical and emotional progress, from Janet about the stability and appropriateness of the current placement, and from a court-appointed advocate who had interviewed Rose and observed her interactions with both Tom and Margaret Hendricks. The advocate's report was telling. Rose had been shy but communicative with Tom, chattering about her new family and showing off pictures she'd drawn of 8 stick figures holding hands. With Margaret Hendricks, she had been withdrawn and clingy, hiding behind the advocate and refusing to engage in conversation. The child shows clear signs of attachment to her current caregiver and the other children in the household, the advocate reported. She demonstrates anxiety and regression when separated from this environment, even temporarily. While Ms. Hendricks is technically qualified for kinship placement, there is no evidence of any previous relationship between aunt and child, and Rose shows no recognition or comfort with her. Judge Kowalski was quiet for a long moment after all testimony had been heard, reviewing notes and documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that her decision would shape the trajectory of a 3-year-old's life. "This case presents a conflict between legal preference for kinship placements and the documented best interests of the child," she said finally. While the court recognizes Ms. Hendricks' legal standing as Rose's aunt, the evidence suggests that removing Rose from her current placement would cause significant trauma and disruption to her emotional development. Tom felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Judge Kowalski continued. Additionally, the court notes that Ms. Hendricks' sudden interest in custody coincides suspiciously with the settlement of the child's inheritance, raising questions about the motivation behind this petition. Margaret Hendricks' face flushed at the implication, but Judge Kowalski wasn't finished. Most importantly, Rose is not an isolated case but part of a sibling group that has formed deep emotional bonds. The court has a responsibility to consider the welfare of all children involved, not just the technical legal status of individual placements. The judge's gaze moved to Rose, who was now drowsing against Katie's shoulder, her small hand clutching her stuffed rabbit. This court finds that Rose's best interests are served by remaining in her current placement with Mr. Mitchell and the other children who have become her family. Ms. Hendricks' petition for custody is denied. The relief that flooded through Tom was so intense, it left him momentarily lightheaded. Around him, he heard Katie's quiet yes and saw tears of relief in Janet's eyes. But Judge Kowalski wasn't finished. However, she continued, and Tom's heart clenched again, this ruling is contingent upon Mr. Mitchell completing the formal foster care licensing process within 60 days and demonstrating his commitment to providing long-term stability for all 8 children currently in his care. She looked directly at Tom, her expression serious but not unkind. Mr. Mitchell, you've taken on an enormous responsibility. 8 children with complex histories and needs require more than good intentions. This court will be monitoring this placement closely, and any evidence that the children's welfare is being compromised will result in immediate review of custody arrangements. Tom nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. Your Honor, these children are my family now. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe and together. See that you do, Judge Kowalski said, then softened slightly. Good luck, Mr. Mitchell. You're going to need it. The drive home from the courthouse was quiet, the children seeming to sense that something important had happened even if they didn't fully understand the legal complexities. Rose had fallen asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the stress of the morning, while Katie sat beside her with the protective posture that had become second nature. We won, Tom said simply, and saw the tension leave 8 small bodies as they absorbed the meaning of those words. All of us? Ben asked, his question carrying the weight of a 10-year-old who had learned not to take security for granted. All of us, Tom confirmed. We're a family, and families stick together. That evening, as they gathered around the kitchen table for dinner, Tom looked at the faces surrounding him and felt the profound shift that had occurred. 3 weeks ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of living. Today, he was the legal guardian of 8 children who had reminded him what it meant to have something worth fighting for. The paperwork ahead would be extensive, the licensing process demanding, and the daily challenges of raising 8 children would test every resource he possessed. But as he watched Lucy help Rose cut her chicken into manageable pieces, saw Sam and Maya collaborating on an elaborate tower built from dinner rolls, and noticed how Katie automatically counted heads to make sure everyone was accounted for, Tom knew he had found his purpose. Sarah would have loved this chaos, he realized. She would have embraced these children with the fierce protectiveness that came naturally to her, would have fought for them with the determination that had characterized everything she did. In caring for them, Tom was not just honoring her memory, but fulfilling the dreams they had shared about filling their house with children's laughter. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and promised snow before morning. But inside Willow Creek Ranch, 8 children were safe and warm and loved, part of a family that had chosen itself and proven strong enough to survive legal challenges and bureaucratic obstacles. Tomorrow would bring new tests. There would be school enrollment to navigate, therapy appointments to schedule, and the complex process of helping 8 traumatized children learn to trust that this stability was permanent. There would be court-mandated home visits, progress reports, and the ongoing scrutiny that came with emergency placements becoming permanent arrangements. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Tom Mitchell fell asleep to the sounds of family life echoing through his house, secure in the knowledge that 8 children would wake up tomorrow knowing they belonged somewhere, knowing they were wanted, and knowing that families came in all shapes and sizes, but were always built on the foundation of people choosing to love and protect each other, no matter what challenges the world might bring. 6 months later, Tom stood in the same barn where he'd first discovered 8 frightened children, but now it hummed with purposeful activity as the entire town of Cedar Falls prepared for what had become known as the Harvest Festival. What had started as a simple celebration of the children's legal adoption had grown into something much larger, a community acknowledgement of the unconventional family that had formed itself through choice, determination, and the kind of stubborn love that refused to be categorized by traditional definitions. The transformation hadn't been easy. The weeks following the custody hearing had tested every resource Tom possessed, both emotional and practical. 8 children recovering from trauma didn't heal on a convenient schedule, and there had been nights when he'd questioned whether love and good intentions were enough to overcome the damage that had been done by a system that had failed them. Katie had spent the first month after the hearing waiting for the other shoe to drop, her 12-year-old hypervigilance manifesting in elaborate escape plans and careful rationing of food even when the pantry was full. She would wake up in the middle of the night to check on the younger children, her sleep disrupted by dreams where social workers came to take them away in separate cars, heading to different destinations. Ben had tested every boundary Tom established, his 10-year-old mind convinced that if he could just push hard enough, he could prove that this placement would fail like all the others. He broke rules with scientific precision, measuring Tom's responses and waiting for the explosion that would justify his certainty that adults couldn't be trusted to keep their promises. The twins had regressed to speaking only to each other, their 5-year-old voices creating an elaborate private language that excluded everyone else. Emma stopped eating anything that wasn't prepared by Ethan, while Ethan refused to sleep unless he could see Emma, their trauma response manifesting in an interdependence that was both touching and concerning. Maya had begun hoarding small objects, filling hidden corners of her room with treasures that ranged from pretty rocks to broken crayons, her 6-year-old mind convinced that, if she accumulated enough possessions, she couldn't be moved again. Her stuffed rabbit became so worn from constant handling that Dr. Chun had to perform emergency surgery to reattach its arms. Sam had developed a stutter that emerged whenever he was stressed, his 7-year-old voice stumbling over words when adults asked direct questions or when he sensed tension in the household. He shadowed Tom constantly, as if physical proximity could guarantee that this adult wouldn't disappear like so many others had. Lucy, their designated optimist, had surprised everyone by becoming the most defiant, her 8-year-old rage finally surfacing after months of trying to keep everyone's spirits up. She threw epic tantrums over minor disappointments, her emotional explosions serving as release valves for accumulated grief and loss that she'd been carrying for far too long. And Rose, sweet 3-year-old Rose, had nightmares that sent her wandering through the house at all hours, her small voice calling for people who couldn't answer anymore, her sleep disrupted by memories she was too young to process, but too traumatized to forget. Tom had navigated those early months with a combination of intuition, professional help, and sheer determination. Dr. Chun had connected them with a trauma-informed therapist in the valley, a woman named Dr. Sarah Winters, whose gentle expertise helped both Tom and the children understand that healing wasn't linear and that progress often looked like taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The licensing process had been extensive and invasive, social workers conducting home visits, with the frequency of medical checkups, documenting everything from refrigerator contents to bedtime routines. Tom had completed courses in trauma-informed care, child development, and crisis intervention, his evenings filled with textbooks and online modules while 8 children slowly learned, that his presence was a constant they could count on. School enrollment process had been its own odyssey, with 8 children at various academic levels requiring individualized education plans and careful integration into Cedar Falls Elementary. Some teachers had embraced the challenge with enthusiasm, while others had whispered about the disruptive potential of foster children with behavioral issues. Tom had learned to advocate fiercely while maintaining diplomatic relationships, understanding that his children's futures depended on adult cooperation. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, healing had begun to take root. Katie's escape plans had evolved into elaborate family game nights that she organized with military precision. Ben's boundary testing had transformed into a healthy assertiveness that suggested he was beginning to believe that his opinions mattered. The twins had slowly begun including others in their private conversations, their language expanding to welcome new family members into their previously exclusive world. Maya's hoarding had given way to generous sharing, her room becoming a distribution center for small gifts that she crafted for her siblings. Sam's stutter had disappeared almost entirely, replaced by the confident chatter of a boy who knew his voice would be heard and valued. Lucy's defiance had mellowed into the kind of spirited independence that suggested she was beginning to trust that expressing her needs wouldn't result in abandonment. And Rose, miraculous Rose, had begun sleeping through the night, her dreams gradually shifting from nightmares about loss to adventures involving the family that had chosen to keep her. The legal adoption had been finalized 3 weeks ago, a process that had required mountains of paperwork, multiple court appearances, and the kind of bureaucratic patience that Tom had never known he possessed. Judge Kowalski had presided over the ceremony with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a system working exactly as it was supposed to, recognizing that families came in all configurations, and that love was more important than DNA. 8 children had officially become 8 Mitchells, their new birth certificates bearing Tom's name in the space reserved for father. The celebration that followed had been modest and private, just the 9 of them and Dr. Chun and Janet Morrison, but it had carried the weight of dreams fulfilled and promises kept. Now as Tom watched his children transform their barn into a festival venue, he marveled at how completely they had claimed this space and made it their own. The same loft where they had once huddled for warmth now served as a stage for the talent show that Lucy had organized with characteristic enthusiasm. The hay bales that had provided makeshift beds were now arranged as seating for the community dinner that Katie had planned with the precision of a military operation. The entire town had embraced the festival with the kind of wholehearted participation that characterized small mountain communities. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had organized the pie contest with the dedication of someone conducting international diplomacy. Sheriff Harrison had volunteered to run the games booth, his law enforcement skills apparently transferring well to supervising ring toss and duck pond activities. Pastor Webb had agreed to provide the blessing for the meal, his presence lending official recognition to their unconventional family structure. Even Margaret Hendricks had surprised everyone by making a generous donation to the festival, her gesture accompanied by a note acknowledging that Rose was clearly thriving in her current family and expressing regret for the disruption her custody petition had caused. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to receive, and Tom had chosen to interpret it as recognition that sometimes the best thing adults could do for children was to step aside and let love take its course. The barn had been decorated with a combination of autumn harvest themes and family photos that chronicled their journey from 8 strangers, sharing pancakes to 9 Mitchells who couldn't imagine life without each other. Pictures of court dates and therapy sessions were interspersed with images of birthday celebrations and school plays, creating a visual narrative of healing and growth. Tom found himself studying one particular photo that Dr. Chen had taken without their knowledge, capturing a moment from their second week together. When all 8 children had fallen asleep in the living room while watching a movie, they were tangled together like puppies, their small bodies seeking comfort and security from each other even in sleep. Looking at it now, Tom could see the exact moment when 8 individual children had become one family. Tom, look. Rose's voice interrupted his reverie, and he turned to see his youngest daughter leading a parade of other small children toward the face-painting station that Maya had organized with artistic precision. At 3.5, Rose moved through the world with the confidence of a child who knew she belonged somewhere, her laughter ringing across the barn like music. Katie approached him with a clipboard and the serious expression that meant she was in full event coordination mode. At 30 now, she had grown into her role as big sister with a grace that amazed him daily. Her natural leadership skills were channeled into protective nurturing rather than survival vigilance, and she had become the kind of young woman that other kids automatically look to for guidance and support. "We need to start seating people for dinner in 15 minutes, she reported with characteristic efficiency. "Ben's got the sound system working. The twins have finished setting up the dessert table, and Sam's helping Dr. Chun with the microphone for the speeches." Tom nodded, marveling at how seamlessly his children had organized this celebration while maintaining their individual personalities and strengths. Ben's technical aptitude had made him the go-to person for anything involving electronics or mechanical systems. The twins had developed into a formidable team for any task requiring creativity and attention to detail. Sam had discovered a talent for public speaking that suggested a future in leadership, while Maya's artistic abilities had transformed every aspect of the festival's visual appeal. Lucy bounded up to join them, her 9-year-old energy barely contained by her role as master of ceremonies for the evening's entertainment. "Dad, are you ready for your speech? Because I wrote backup remarks in case you get nervous and forget what you want to say." The casual use of Dad still caught Tom off guard sometimes, though all 8 children had adopted the title naturally once the adoption was finalized. It carried weight beyond legal designation, representing their choice to claim him as fully as he had claimed them. "I think I'll manage," Tom said, ruffling Lucy's hair affectionately. "But I appreciate having backup." As the community began filing into the barn, Tom was struck by how many people had become invested in their family's success. Teachers who had worked extra hours to help his children catch up academically. Neighbors who had volunteered for carpools and babysitting when Tom's work on the ranch demanded long hours. Local business owners who had quietly ensured that school supplies and winter clothes appeared whenever they were needed. Dr. Chun approached him with a smile that suggested she was thinking about the same thing. Amazing what can happen when a community decides to embrace something instead of just tolerating it, she said, watching as Sheriff Harrison helped Rose navigate the ring toss game with exaggerated seriousness. "I couldn't have done this alone," Tom admitted, and the statement carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "None of us could have." The dinner that followed was a feast in every sense of the word, not just of food, but of community and connection. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes that represented every family's contribution, creating a meal that was both abundant and diverse. Tom looked around at the faces surrounding him and saw the reflection of his own journey in the stories of others who had opened their hearts to children who needed somewhere to belong. When it came time for speeches, Tom stood before a crowd that included everyone who had played a role in helping his family become whole. He looked at 8 children who were watching him with the kind of attention that suggested his words mattered to them, and felt the profound responsibility of speaking, not just for himself, but for every family that had formed itself through choice rather than biology. "6 months ago," he began, his voice carrying across the barn that had sheltered 8 cold, frightened children, "I thought I knew what family meant. I thought it was about shared history and blood relationships, and the kind of bonds that were predetermined by genetics." He paused, looking at Katie's serious face, at Ben's supportive nod, at the twins sharing a smile, at Maya holding Rose on her lap while Sam and Lucy flanked them protectively. "These 8 children taught me that family is actually about choice. It's about people deciding to love each other, not because they have to, but because they want to. It's about creating safety and belonging in a world that can be harsh and uncertain. It's about showing up every day and proving that love is stronger than fear, that hope is more powerful than hurt. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Tom wasn't finished. This community has shown us that families extend beyond individual households, that it takes an entire network of caring adults to help children heal and thrive. You've all been part of our family's story, and we're grateful beyond words. As the evening wound down and the last neighbors headed home across frost-covered fields, Tom found himself alone with his children in the barn where their story had begun. 8 kids who had once huddled together for warmth now sprawled comfortably across hay bales, their bellies full and their hearts content. This was the best day ever, Rose announced with the definitive authority that only 3-year-olds could muster, and her siblings nodded in agreement. Better than Christmas? Sam asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Better than Christmas, Caddy confirmed, and coming from their resident organizer of holiday celebrations. That carried significant weight. Tom looked around at his children, these 8 individuals who had become his entire world, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they were exactly where they belonged. The barn that had once represented desperation and fear had been transformed into a symbol of hope and healing, a place where a community had gathered to celebrate the radical idea that love could overcome any obstacle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did when you were raising 8 children with complex histories and bright futures. There would be parent-teacher conferences and therapy appointments, teenage drama and childhood illnesses, the 1,000 daily decisions that came with being responsible for 8 young lives. But tonight, in a barn decorated with harvest symbols and family photos, 9 people who had chosen each other sat surrounded by the warmth of community acceptance and the knowledge that they had created something beautiful from circumstances that could have been devastating. Tom Mitchell had found 8 children in his barn, but they had given him something far more valuable in return. They had given him a family, a purpose, and the understanding that sometimes the most broken places could become the foundation for the most beautiful new beginnings. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, delivered by a postal service truck that kicked up dust clouds as it wound up the gravel drive toward the ranch house. Tom was in the barn helping Emma repair a fence panel that had been damaged during the previous night's storm when he heard the familiar sound of mail delivery echoing across the valley. Letters had become routine at Willow Creek Ranch, arriving daily from social workers, educational consultants, other foster families, and the steady stream of professionals who had become part of their extended network. But this envelope was different, bearing the official seal of the State Child Welfare Department, and addressed with the kind of formal precision that suggested important news inside. Tom set down his hammer and walked toward the house, noting the way his children automatically glanced up from their various activities to track his movement. After 5 years together, they had developed an almost telepathic awareness of each other's moods and concerns, their early trauma having created a hypervigilance that had gradually evolved into protective attentiveness. Katie was the first to notice his expression as he opened the envelope on the front porch, her 17-year-old intuition immediately picking up on the shift in his demeanor. She set down the textbook she'd been using to help Lucy with algebra and moved closer, her protective instincts as finely tuned as they had been during those early desperate days when keeping the family together had required constant vigilance. "What is it?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that still emerged whenever official communications threatened their stability. Tom read the letter twice before responding, his mind processing implications that reached far beyond their individual family unit. "The state wants to nominate our program for a National Excellence Award," he said slowly. "They're calling it an innovative model for sibling preservation and therapeutic intervention." The response from his children was immediate and complex. Pride mixed with wariness, excitement tempered by the learned caution of those who had experienced how quickly recognition could turn into unwanted scrutiny. Ben emerged from the garage where he'd been working on his latest engineering project, his 15-year-old face already showing the analytical approach that characterized his problem-solving style. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, cutting straight to the practical implications with characteristic directness. Tom continued reading, his expression growing more thoughtful as he absorbed the details. "It means a site visit from federal reviewers, extensive documentation of our methods and outcomes, and if we're selected, presentation at a national conference on child welfare innovation." Lucy bounced slightly with contained excitement, her 14-year-old enthusiasm barely restrained by growing maturity. "That sounds amazing. Think of all the other kids who could benefit if more places tried to do what we do here." But Sam, now 13 and possessed of an emotional intelligence that sometimes surprised adults, voiced the concern that several of his siblings were thinking but hadn't articulated. "Will it change things here? Will they want to make us into something different than what we are?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, carrying weight that extended beyond simple curiosity. Their family had been built on the foundation of being different, of refusing to conform to traditional models that hadn't served any of them well. The thought of being pressured to modify their approach to fit external expectations was genuinely threatening. Tom folded the letter carefully and looked around at the 8 young people who had taught him everything important he knew about resilience, healing, and the true meaning of family. "We'll listen to what they have to say," he said finally. "But we won't change who we are or how we do things just to win an award. Our success isn't measured by recognition from outside. It's measured by whether you all feel safe, loved, and supported to become whoever you're meant to be." The relief that relaxed their postures was subtle but noticeable, the kind of shared exhale that came from a family unit that had learned to trust their patriarch's judgment while also maintaining healthy skepticism about outside authorities. Maya, now 11 and still the family's most intuitive emotional barometer, approached the conversation with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Maybe it would be good for other kids if people knew that families like ours could work," she said quietly. "Maybe there are other groups of brothers and sisters who need to know it's possible to stay together." Her observation sparked a family discussion that continued through dinner and into the evening. 8 children and one father debating the merits of public recognition versus private contentment. It was exactly the kind of democratic decision-making process that had evolved naturally in their household, where every voice carried weight and consensus emerged through respectful dialogue rather than authoritarian decree. Ethan, now 10 and increasingly articulate about his thoughts and feelings, raised a concern that surprised everyone with its sophistication. What if they want to study us like we're experiments? What if they want to know things about our past that we don't want to share with strangers? The question revealed the depth of thought that lay beneath his artistic exterior, the way trauma had taught him to consider unintended consequences of seemingly positive developments. Tom felt his chest tighten with protective anger at the idea of his children being treated as research subjects rather than individuals with inherent dignity and privacy rights. Any participation would be completely voluntary, Tom assured him, and we would have final approval over what information gets shared and how it gets presented. You're not case studies. You're my children, and your privacy and comfort come before any award or recognition. Emma, practical as always, approached the question from a different angle. How much time would it take? Would it interfere with the programs we're already running for other kids? Her concern reflected the way all 8 children had embraced their roles as mentors and advocates for other youth in care. They took seriously their responsibility to younger visitors, understanding intuitively that their success created hope for others who were still struggling to find stability and belonging. The conversation continued over several days, with input from Dr. Chun, Janet Morrison, and other trusted advisors who had become extended family members. Everyone agreed that recognition could bring valuable resources and attention to their model, potentially helping other communities develop similar programs. But they also recognized the risks that came with public attention. Media scrutiny could invade their privacy, bureaucratic oversight could limit their flexibility, and the pressure to replicate their success could lead to superficial imitations that missed the deeper principles that made their approach effective. In the end, it was Rose who provided the insight that shaped their decision. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of clarity that sometimes emerged from those who had never doubted their place in the world. "We should do it if it helps other kids find families like ours," she said simply. "But we should say no if it makes us stop being ourselves." Her wisdom, delivered with 8-year-old directness, crystallized the family's thinking. They would participate in the nomination process, but on their own terms and with clear boundaries about what they were willing to share and how they wanted to be represented. The federal review team arrived 3 weeks later, a group of 5 professionals whose experience with child welfare systems had prepared them for many things, but perhaps not for the reality of what they encountered at Willow Creek Ranch. They had reviewed hundreds of programs and visited dozens of facilities, but they had never seen anything quite like the Mitchell family in operation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the team leader, was a woman in her 50s whose career had been built on evaluating innovative approaches to child welfare. She arrived expecting to find a well-intentioned but probably unsustainable experiment in family preservation. Instead, she discovered a thriving community that challenged every assumption she held about the limitations of foster care. Her first surprise came during the initial interview, when Tom invited all 8 children to participate in the formal assessment process. In her experience, foster children were typically interviewed separately from their caregivers, the assumption being that they needed protection from adult influence in order to speak honestly about their experiences. But the Mitchell children presented themselves as a unified family unit that included their father as an equal participant, rather than an authority figure to be either pleased or circumvented. They answered questions with thoughtful honesty, corrected each other's memories with affectionate precision, and demonstrated the kind of mutual support that suggested genuine security rather than performance anxiety. Katie, as the eldest, served as an informal spokesperson, but she regularly deferred to her siblings for their individual perspectives and experiences. Her leadership style was collaborative rather than controlling, facilitating discussion rather than dominating it. "The hardest thing about the early days wasn't learning to trust Tom," she explained to the review team. "It was learning to believe that we could trust the situation to be permanent. We'd all been in places where adults said we were safe, but then circumstances changed and suddenly we weren't." Ben elaborated on the point with characteristic analytical precision. "What made this different was that Tom never promised us it would be easy. He promised us we would figure it out together, and that if problems came up, we would solve them as a family rather than by splitting people up." The reviewers were clearly affected by the children's articulateness and the evident depth of their relationships with each other and with Tom, but it was the daily routines and spontaneous interactions that provided the most compelling evidence of their program's effectiveness. They observed family meetings where 8 children and 1 father planned weekend activities with the kind of democratic participation that respected every voice, while still maintaining appropriate adult oversight. They watched homework sessions, where older siblings naturally tutored younger ones, while Tom provided support and encouragement without micromanaging the process. They saw conflict resolution in action when Emma and Ethan had a disagreement about shared responsibilities, the family working together to find a solution that honored both children's perspectives while reinforcing their mutual accountability. The process was neither permissive nor authoritarian, but rather collaborative in a way that strengthened relationships while addressing practical problems. But perhaps most importantly, they witnessed the way the Mitchell children interacted with visiting foster youth, providing peer support that was both compassionate and realistic. There was no false cheerfulness or minimization of difficulties, but rather honest acknowledgement that healing was possible, and that families could be created through choice rather than biology. Lucy's interaction with a shy 7-year-old visitor was particularly illuminating. Rather than overwhelming the child with enthusiasm, she sat quietly beside her during animal feeding time, offering gentle commentary about the chickens' personalities while allowing the girl to participate at her own pace. "The brown one is kind of bossy," Lucy observed conversationally. "She reminds me of Katie when we first got here, and she was trying to take care of everyone all by herself. But see how the others still come to her when they're scared. That's because being protective isn't the same as being mean." The metaphor was subtle but clear, helping the visiting child understand that the complicated feelings she might have about authority figures were normal, and that safety could coexist with structure. Sam's approach to mentoring was different but equally effective, using his own experience with speech difficulties to connect with a 10-year-old boy who had been selectively mute since entering care. "Sometimes words get stuck when you're not sure if people really want to hear them," Sam said quietly, sitting beside the boy while they brushed one of the therapy horses. "But horses are good listeners. They don't judge or interrupt or try to fix everything. They just pay attention." The boy didn't speak during that session, but he returned to the horse every day for the remainder of his weekend visit, gradually progressing from silence to whispered comments to tentative conversation with Sam, serving as patient facilitator. Maya's artistic workshops provided another avenue for communication, allowing children to express feelings and experiences that were too complex or painful for words. Her gentle guidance helped visitors create visual narratives of their experiences, while also imagining possibilities for their futures. The review team documented dozens of such interactions, each one demonstrating the unique value of peer support provided by children who had successfully navigated similar challenges. But they also observed the way Tom and the other adults created the framework that made such healing possible. Dr. Chun's medical assessments were thorough but unintimidating, conducted in comfortable spaces with trusted adults present and focused on overall wellness rather than pathology. Her approach normalized therapy and emotional support as routine healthcare rather than crisis intervention. The educational support provided by local teachers who had become invested in the ranch's mission went far beyond traditional tutoring, addressing learning differences and trauma-related challenges with creativity and persistence that reflected genuine caring rather than professional obligation. But it was Tom's parenting approach that perhaps most impressed the reviewers. He managed to maintain appropriate authority while also fostering genuine democracy, setting clear boundaries while encouraging independence and providing structure without stifling individuality. His discipline strategies focused on logical consequences and collaborative problem-solving rather than punishment, helping children develop internal motivation and ethical reasoning rather than mere compliance. His approach to academics emphasized progress rather than perfection, supporting each child's individual learning style while maintaining high expectations for effort and growth. Most importantly, his unconditional commitment to keeping the family together sent a message that was more powerful than any therapeutic intervention: that they were worth fighting for, that their relationships with each other mattered, and that families could overcome any challenge when they faced it united. The review process culminated in a formal presentation where the Mitchell family shared their story with the evaluation team, but also with representatives from other agencies who had come to learn from their model. It was exactly the kind of public attention that might once have terrified 8 children who had learned to mistrust adult scrutiny. Instead, they approached it as an opportunity to advocate for other youth in care, sharing their experiences with the confidence of people who knew their story had value beyond their individual circumstances. They spoke honestly about the difficulties they had faced and overcome, but also about the joy and security they had found in belonging to each other. The presentation ended with Rose, the youngest, offering her own perspective on what had made their family successful. Her 8-year-old wisdom, delivered with characteristic directness, provided the perfect conclusion to their story. "The best thing about our family," she said, looking around at 7 siblings and one father who had chosen to love her unconditionally, "is that we never have to worry about whether we belong here. We know we do, because we picked each other. And we keep picking each other every day." The award notification arrived 6 weeks later, but by then the recognition felt almost secondary to the deeper satisfaction that came from knowing they had shared their story in a way that honored their journey while potentially helping other children find their own paths to healing and belonging. They had remained true to themselves while opening their hearts to the possibility that their love could ripple outward, creating hope for others who needed to believe that families came in all shapes and sizes and that home was wherever people chose to love each other unconditionally. 10 years had passed since that cold October morning when Tom Mitchell first heard children crying in his barn. And now he stood in the same doorway watching his daughter Katie, 22 years old, and fresh from her master's degree in social work, lead a training session for new foster parents from across 3 counties. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived the challenges she was teaching others to navigate, but also the warmth of someone who genuinely believed that love could overcome any obstacle. The barn had been transformed once again, this time into a state-of-the-art conference center that hosted monthly educational programs, quarterly regional conferences, and an annual national symposium that drew child welfare professionals from around the world. But despite its professional upgrades, it still carried the essential character that had made it a sanctuary for 8 frightened children a decade ago. Tom felt the weight of the years in his bones as he watched his children, now ranging in age from 13 to 22, move through their daily routines with the confidence of young people who had never doubted their place in the world. Each of the children had grown in extraordinary ways, but perhaps the most profound transformation had taken place in Tom himself, the once lonely widower whose life was forever changed by 8 children, who had rescued him as much as he had them. Rose, now 13, exuded a calm confidence that belied her age. She led a small group of younger visitors through the morning animal care tasks, her voice steady as she coached an anxious 8-year-old boy reminding Tom so much of a younger Sam. It made his heart ache. "Animals can sense fear," she told him gently, "but they don't hold it against you. They just want to know you'll be kind and steady." Her maturity and empathy were a reflection of both her natural sensitivity and the example set by her older siblings, along with the unspoken lessons she'd absorbed growing up in a space where healing was part of everyday life. Maya, 16, and preparing for college, was overseeing a mural project with a group of teen girls. She planned to study art therapy and had long since moved beyond using art to process her own pain. Her work had grown into something more, a tool to help others. The mural depicted the barn across all 4 seasons, symbolizing the ranch's transformation from a place of emergency shelter to one of long-term healing. Hidden in the artwork were personal touches only insiders would recognize: Rose's makeshift tarp blanket, the water trough Ben had learned to fix, and the loft where they had first become a family. 18-year-old Sam, headed to college in the fall on a full scholarship for public speaking and debate, was filming a documentary about the ranch's long-term impact. His thoughtful interviewing style put even the most hesitant subjects at ease. One young woman, a graduate of the weekend program, summed it up best: "This place didn't just keep me and my sister together. It showed us that we could build and keep a family by choosing each other." At 15, the twins Emma and Ethan had already become powerful voices for youth aging out of foster care. Emma's practical skills had matured into a deep understanding of nonprofit leadership and program design, while Ethan's musical talent had led to a scholarship fund that provided instruments and lessons for children in foster care across the region. Lucy, 19 and halfway through college, was studying psychology and communications. She had founded a national peer support network for former foster youth and used her natural humor to bring light into tough conversations. What had once been a coping mechanism had become her superpower, using laughter to heal and resist. Ben, now 20, was close to completing an engineering degree. His early fascination with taking things apart had turned into designing innovative solutions to help similar ranches and rural communities across the country. His work was already making a difference. Yet beyond all their achievements, it was the way they related to one another and to Tom that showed the deepest proof of their family strength. 10 years of shared life had built a rhythm of comfort and connection. Mornings still began with a family breakfast, just as they had during those first chaotic weeks, though the table now had to accommodate college schedules, jobs, and a web of responsibilities. They all pursued their individual goals, but always stayed connected, always came home. Tom found himself thinking about Sarah more often, not with the raw pain of grief, but with a soft gratitude. She would have loved seeing what their shared dream had become. The yellow guest room had seen dozens of children come and go over the years. The once crowded kitchen now cooked for 20 or more, its upgraded appliances a testament to years of feeding both bodies and souls. Tom, once hopeless in the kitchen, had become a master of breakfast, his formerly inedible pancakes now a beloved tradition. The house itself had grown, expanded twice over the years, but always with care to preserve its warmth and spirit. Children's drawings still covered the fridge. Photos lined the walls. Laughter echoed from every corner. It didn't feel like a facility, it felt like a home. Dr. Chun, in her 40s now, remained the ranch's medical director. Though she had never married, she often said the ranch provided all the family she'd ever wanted. Her clinic had become a training ground for rural doctors, learning how to care for children with complex trauma, bridging physical and emotional healing. Janet Morrison, now State Director of Child Welfare Innovation, still kept close ties with the Mitchell family. She hadn't missed a graduation or family milestone in years. Her groundbreaking work had helped change state policy on keeping siblings together, just as she'd done for Tom's children when they needed her most. Even Sheriff Harrison, well into his 70s, continued to mentor at the ranch. Though officially retired, he taught conflict resolution and safety skills with the gentle authority of a beloved grandfather. His steady presence had helped many children overcome fear and rebuild trust in authority figures. The town of Cedar Falls had grown to now home to 1,500 residents, many drawn by the ranch's reputation and the sense of shared purpose the community fostered. Businesses offered specialized support for foster families, and the school district had become a model of trauma-informed education. But the most meaningful legacy couldn't be seen in statistics or infrastructure. It was in the bonds between the original 8. They still gathered for holidays and birthdays, still leaned on each other through every triumph and trial. Katie's wedding the previous summer had taken place in the barn where their journey began, with all 7 siblings standing beside her and Tom walking her down the aisle, surrounded by flowers from Sarah's garden. Her husband, a social worker, inspired by the ranch before he even met Katie, fit into the family seamlessly. Ben's girlfriend, a fellow engineering student who spent breaks fixing things at the ranch, had already been embraced by the group. Lucy's partner, a passionate youth advocate like herself, had become part of the ever-expanding family circle. The younger kids were beginning to explore relationships of their own, but with a strong sense of self and the confidence that love was meant to enhance, not replace, the family they already had. The ranch's influence had spread well beyond Cedar Falls, Tom frequently consulted with organizations across the country and abroad, sharing not just their methods but the values behind them, that keeping siblings together matters, that healing happens in safe relationships, and that family can be created through intention and care. Research supported their success: high placement stability, better educational outcomes, and lasting emotional health. But numbers alone couldn't capture what truly mattered. The real proof was in moments like Rose comforting a frightened child, showing that love didn't need to be earned, it was given freely. Tom's transformation mirrored that of his children. Once a grieving man watching the clock for bedtime, he was now a sought-after speaker, advisor, and respected figure in child welfare. But the titles didn't matter as much as the mornings like this one, where he watched his children pass on the lessons they'd once needed themselves. Lessons in safety, connection, and unconditional love. But his greatest achievement remained the 8 young people who called him Dad and had taught him that parenting was not about perfection, but about presence. Not about having all the answers, but about being willing to figure things out together. The letter that had started their journey toward national recognition now hung framed in the ranch office, alongside dozens of other awards and acknowledgments. But the real treasures were the handmade cards from children who had found hope at the ranch, the photos from weddings and graduations and birthday parties, and the knowledge that their unconventional family had created ripples of healing that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. As evening approached and the day's activities wound down, Tom found himself once again in the barn where it all began, this time watching his children and the visiting youth work together to prepare for the next day's programming. The scene was peaceful and purposeful, filled with the kind of comfortable productivity that came from people who knew they belonged somewhere and had work worth doing. Rose approached him with the sunset light streaming through the barn doors. Behind her, her 13-year-old face carrying the same confidence that had sustained her through every challenge they had faced together. "Dad," she said, using the title that still filled Tom's heart with wonder after all these years. "Mrs. Chun wants to know if we're ready for next week's intake orientation. We have 5 new families coming for the weekend program." Tom nodded, thinking about the preparation involved in welcoming newcomers while maintaining the established rhythms that kept their community stable and healing. It was complex work that required constant attention to both individual needs and group dynamics, but it was work that had become as natural as breathing after 10 years of practice. "We're ready," he said, and meant it. They had learned over the years that readiness wasn't about having perfect systems or avoiding all difficulties, but about approaching each new challenge with love, flexibility, and the confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever arose by handling it together. As the last visitors departed and his children settled into their evening routines, Tom walked the familiar path from barn to house, noting the way the landscape had changed over the years, but still retained its essential character. New buildings had been added, gardens had been expanded, and infrastructure had been improved. But the heart of the place remained the same, a sanctuary where children could heal and families could form and love could triumph over any obstacle. The kitchen was warm and welcoming as always, filled with the comfortable chaos of multiple people sharing space and responsibilities. Homework was spread across the table, someone was making hot chocolate, and the television murmured with background noise that suggested home rather than entertainment. Tom settled into his chair at the head of the table, the same position he had occupied that first morning when 8 frightened children had eaten terrible pancakes and begun the journey toward becoming a family. Around him, his children moved through their evening routines with the easy familiarity of people who knew they belonged exactly where they were. 10 years ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of living. Tonight, he was the father of 8 remarkable young people who had taught him that love was indeed stronger than fear, that families could be created through choice and commitment, and that sometimes the most broken places could become the foundation for the key most beautiful new beginnings. The note that had started it all, carefully folded and yellowed with age, still resided in his wallet, a reminder of 8 children, who had asked for nothing more than a place to stay warm and had given him everything that mattered. "Dear Barn Owner," it began, and Tom smiled as he remembered the formal politeness of children who had been forced to grow up too quickly but had somehow retained their capacity for hope. They had apologized for being in his barn without permission, but Tom knew now that they had been exactly where they belonged all along. 8 children had found him on that cold October morning, but they had given him far more than he had given them. They had given him purpose, joy, and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood, silent and eternal, under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, 9 people who had chosen each other were safe and warm and loved, surrounded by the knowledge that home was not a place but a feeling, not a building but a commitment, not a destination, but a journey taken together with hearts wide, open to whatever wonders tomorrow might bring. 20 years had passed since that October morning when 8 children changed Tom Mitchell's life forever, and now the mountains surrounding Willow Creek Ranch echoed with the laughter of a 3rd generation discovering what it meant to belong somewhere without question. Tom, now 65 and moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body carried the weight of decades spent building something beautiful from broken pieces, stood on his front porch watching his granddaughter chase chickens while her mother, Katie, supervised with the patient amusement of someone who had once been that fearless child herself. The ranch had evolved far beyond anything Tom could have imagined during those early desperate days, when keeping 8 children fed and housed had felt like an insurmountable challenge. What had begun as an emergency placement for homeless siblings had become a cornerstone institution in rural child welfare, but more importantly, it had remained exactly what it had always been at its heart, a place where love conquered fear and families were built on choice rather than chance. Katie's 3-year-old daughter, Sarah Grace, named for the grandmother she would never meet, but whose spirit lived on in every garden bloom and yellow-painted wall, embodied the security that came from being born into unshakable belonging. She moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never doubted that she was cherished, her laughter creating ripples of joy that seemed to heal old wounds simply by existing. The sight of her filled Tom with a contentment so profound it sometimes brought tears to his eyes. Here was living proof that the broken cycle could stay broken, that children raised with unconditional love grew into adults capable of creating secure attachments and passing on the gift of belonging to the next generation. Ben's twin boys, now 5 years old and displaying the same analytical curiosity that had characterized their father, were helping their Uncle Sam organize equipment for the afternoon's educational program. At 23, Sam had returned to the ranch after completing his master's degree in family therapy, bringing with him innovations in trauma-informed care that combined cutting-edge research with the wisdom he had gained growing up in recovery. Lucy's adopted daughter, a 7-year-old who had arrived through the same system that had once failed all of them, was teaching a group of visiting children how to braid friendship bracelets, her patient instruction carrying forward the tradition of older siblings nurturing younger ones. At 24, Lucy had become a nationally recognized advocate for foster youth, but she insisted that her most important work happened right here, in moments like these when healing passed from one generation to the next. The twins, Emma and Ethan, now 20, had both chosen to attend college locally so they could remain connected to the ranch's daily operations. Emma was studying sustainable agriculture with plans to revolutionize how therapeutic communities supported themselves financially, while Ethan's music therapy program had expanded to serve children across 5 counties. Their commitment to staying close reflected not dependence, but choice, the decision of young adults who understood that home was a treasure worth preserving. Maya, at 21, had returned from art school with her partner Alex, a fellow artist whose gentle spirit had immediately been welcomed into their complex but loving family dynamic. Together, they had established a program that used creative expression to help children process trauma, their studio in the converted grain silo becoming a sanctuary for young souls learning to transform pain into beauty. Rose, now 18, preparing for her freshman year at the State University, moved through her final summer at home with the bittersweet awareness of someone about to embark on her own adventure while remaining forever connected to the place that had shaped her. She planned to study early childhood development, her career goals influenced by a lifetime of watching love work miracles in the lives of frightened children. But it was the daily rhythms of family life that provided the most compelling evidence of their enduring success. 20 years had created traditions and inside jokes, established roles and evolving relationships, the kind of deep intimacy that came from weathering storms together and emerging stronger. Their Sunday dinners now accommodated spouses and children, partners and close friends, sometimes swelling to include 30 or more people gathered around tables that had been expanded and rearranged countless times but never lost their essential character as places where everyone belonged. The conversations ranged from toddler babble to graduate school dissertations, from ranch business to global politics, creating a symphony of voices that spoke to the richness of lives lived in authentic relationship. Tom's role had evolved over the years from desperate novice to respected patriarch, but he had never lost the humility that came from understanding how much his children had taught him about courage, resilience, and the true meaning of family. His hair was white now, his hands marked by decades of ranch work and child-rearing, but his eyes still carried the wonder of someone who had been saved by the very people he had thought he was rescuing. The ranch's influence had spread far beyond their immediate community, with similar programs operating in 17 states in 3 countries, all based on the principles that had emerged from their lived experience, that children deserved to be kept together when possible, that healing happened in relationship, and that families could transcend biology when built on commitment and unconditional love. But perhaps the most profound measure of their success was visible in the way his children approached their own relationships and parenting. They chose partners who understood that love was an action rather than a feeling, who embraced the complexity of a family that included adopted siblings, chosen family members, and the ongoing presence of children who needed temporary safety, while their own situations stabilized. Katie's marriage to David, now 7 years strong, had been built on shared values and mutual respect, their partnership modeling healthy attachment for both their daughter and the countless children who observed their interactions. David had been drawn to the ranch's mission before he was drawn to Katie, but his love for her had deepened his commitment to their shared work. Ben's relationship with Maria had survived the challenges of graduate school, long-distance separation, and the complex logistics of building a life together while remaining connected to extended family obligations. Their wedding 3 years ago had been held in the barn where it all began, with 7 siblings serving in the ceremony and Tom offering a blessing that acknowledged the sacred nature of chosen commitment. Lucy's journey to parenthood through adoption had been supported by siblings who understood intimately the courage required to open your heart to a child who had been wounded by previous losses. Her daughter's integration into their family had been seamless, the little girl immediately claiming 7 aunts and uncles who competed to spoil her while also teaching her the values that had sustained them all. The younger generation was beginning to form their own romantic attachments, but with the confidence of people who knew that healthy relationships enhanced rather than replaced family connections. They approached dating with wisdom born from watching love in action, understanding that partnership should be based on shared values and mutual growth rather than neediness or fear of abandonment. Dr. Chun, now 55 and still the ranch's medical director, had finally married at 47, her wedding celebration becoming a community event that acknowledged her role as honorary aunt to dozens of children who had found healing under her care. Her husband, a fellow physician who had been drawn to rural medicine by the ranch's model of integrated care, had been welcomed into their extended family with characteristic warmth. Janet Morrison, now approaching retirement after a distinguished career in child welfare innovation, still maintained her special connection to the Mitchell family, her office walls covered with photos from graduations, weddings, and birthday celebrations spanning 2 decades. Her advocacy had influenced policy changes that had improved outcomes for thousands of children across the region. The community of Cedar Falls had grown to nearly 3,000 residents, its expansion carefully managed to preserve the small-town character that made it attractive to families seeking purposeful community engagement. Local businesses had developed specialized services supporting therapeutic foster care, and the school district had become a destination for educators interested in trauma-informed teaching practices. But the true measure of their impact was visible in the ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate sphere. Former program participants had gone on to become foster parents themselves, teachers specializing in working with at-risk youth, social workers dedicated to family preservation, and advocates for systemic reform. The healing they had experienced was being passed forward in countless ways, creating expanding circles of hope and possibility. Tom's own transformation had been as remarkable as his children's. The isolated widower who had once struggled to fill his days with meaning had become a nationally recognized expert on alternative family structures. But more importantly, he had become the kind of father who was present for every milestone, celebration, and crisis that touched his children's lives. His relationship with Sarah's memory had evolved over the years from sharp grief to gentle gratitude. He spoke of her often to his children and grandchildren, sharing stories that kept her spirit alive while also acknowledging how completely his life had been transformed by events she never could have imagined. The yellow guest room had been repainted many times over the years, but it remained a symbol of dreams deferred but not abandoned, hope that had found expression in ways neither he nor Sarah could have anticipated. The barn where it all began now served as both working facility and memorial, its walls lined with photos that chronicled 20 years of children finding safety, families forming, and love conquering circumstances that might have seemed insurmountable. The original note, now carefully preserved under glass, served as a reminder of 8 children who had asked for nothing more than a place to stay warm and had given him everything that mattered. As afternoon faded toward evening and the day's activities wound down, Tom found himself once again in the barn doorway, this time watching his daughter Rose lead a group of teenage program participants in preparing for the next day's activities. At 18, she moved with the grace of someone who had never questioned her place in the world, her natural leadership abilities channeled into gentle guidance rather than control. The scene was peaceful and purposeful, filled with the comfortable productivity that came from people who knew they belonged somewhere and had work worth doing. The teenagers, visiting for a week-long intensive program, had arrived suspicious and guarded, but were already beginning to relax into the rhythm of community life that made healing possible. Tom thought about the letter that had arrived that morning, an invitation to speak at an international conference on family preservation. There had been hundreds of such invitations over the years, opportunities to share their story with audiences who needed to believe that alternative approaches could work. He accepted them selectively now, choosing engagements that aligned with their values while protecting the privacy and normalcy that his family treasured. But perhaps more meaningful than any professional recognition were the personal letters that arrived regularly from former program participants, young adults sharing news of graduations, marriages, career achievements, and their own growing families. Each one represented a life trajectory that had been altered by the belief that children deserved to be kept together when possible and that families could be created through choice and commitment. As darkness settled over the valley and the mountains disappeared into shadow, Tom made his way back to the house where his family was gathering for their traditional Sunday evening meal. The kitchen was warm and welcoming as always, filled with multiple generations sharing stories, planning the week ahead, and simply enjoying each other's company. Sarah Grace was already in her pajamas, her 3-year-old energy finally flagging as bedtime approached. She climbed into Tom's lap with the automatic assumption of welcome that characterized secure attachment, her small body relaxing against his chest as she listened to the adult conversation swirling around her. This was the moment Tom treasured most, the quiet satisfaction that came from watching his family function with the easy intimacy of people who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. 20 years had created inside jokes and established traditions, evolved roles and deepening relationships, the kind of authentic connection that money couldn't buy and institutions couldn't replicate. Around the table sat 8 young adults who had taught him everything important about resilience, healing, and the true nature of family. They had chosen different paths and pursued individual dreams, but they remained connected by bonds that transcended biology and geography. They gathered for every holiday and celebration, supported each other through challenges and achievements, and continued to function as a family unit even as they created families of their own. Their children, the 3rd generation to be shaped by the values that had emerged from desperate necessity, would grow up knowing that love was stronger than fear, that families could be created through choice, and that belonging was a birthright that no one could take away. They would carry forward the understanding that home was not a place but a feeling, not a building but a commitment, not an accident of birth, but a daily decision to love and protect each other. As the evening wound down and his family began preparing for another week of purposeful work, Tom felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life well lived. 20 years ago, he had been a lonely widower counting empty hours until bedtime. Tonight, he was surrounded by evidence that love could indeed triumph over any obstacle, that broken cycles could stay broken, and that the most beautiful families were often those that formed themselves through choice rather than chance. Note that had started it all remained in his wallet, now fragile with age but still carrying the power to move him to tears. 8 children had written those careful words as an apology for trespassing, not knowing they were actually announcing their arrival home. They had found him in his darkest hour and reminded him that healing was possible, that purpose could emerge from pain, and that sometimes the most broken places became the foundation for the most beautiful new beginnings. Outside, the Colorado night was crisp and clear, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch in dreams that had already come true in ways no one could have imagined. Inside, 9 people who had chosen each other were safe and warm and loved, surrounded by the knowledge that family was indeed stronger than circumstances, that hope was indeed more powerful than despair, and that love, in the end, always found a way to win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.